Bank manager. Denies loan to black woman. She returns to buy the bank. Naomi Richardson had built her fortune by acquiring undervalued financial institutions, but she never imagined that her next target would be the very bank that had just humiliated her in front of a lobby full of customers. What happened next would become Wall Street legend. The day a loan rejection turned into a hostile takeover and a single act of discrimination cost an entire institution its independence. The marble floors of First National Bank gleamed under the afternoon sun, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the grand lobby. At 45, Naomi Richardson moved through the space with the measured confidence of someone who had spent the last 15 years navigating the treacherous waters of high finance. Her tailored charcoal suit was understated but expensive, her natural hair styled in an elegant twist that showcased both her professionalism and her heritage. The briefcase she carried contained documentation that most people would never see in their lifetimes: portfolio summaries, investment records, and acquisition histories that painted the picture of a woman who had turned financial strategy into an art form. First National Bank had been founded in 1923, and its headquarters building reflected that heritage with imposing granite columns, brass fixtures that had been polished daily for nearly a century, and oil paintings of former bank presidents who had guided the institution through depressions, wars, and economic booms. The lobby was designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure, a cathedral to capitalism that had welcomed the city's elite for generations while quietly excluding those deemed unworthy of its services. Naomi had done her homework on First National with the thoroughness that had made her one of the most successful acquisition specialists on the East Coast. The bank was struggling, though they hid it well behind their prestigious facade. Bad loans, outdated technology, and a management team more concerned with maintaining their social status than adapting to changing markets had left the institution vulnerable. She had been circling First National for months, waiting for the right moment to make her move. That moment, she had decided, was today. But first, she wanted to experience their customer service firsthand, to understand exactly what she would be purchasing when she made her offer. What she hadn't expected was to discover just how deeply the bank's problems ran beneath its polished surface. The loan department occupied a section of the main floor, separated from the general banking area by glass partitions that created the illusion of privacy while allowing management to monitor every interaction. Naomi approached the reception desk, where a young woman with carefully styled blonde hair and a practiced smile greeted customers with the kind of professional warmth that masked any personal feelings about the people she served. "Good afternoon," the receptionist said, her voice carrying the trained pleasantness of someone who had been coached on customer service protocols. "How may I assist you today?" "I'd like to speak with someone about a business loan," Naomi replied, her tone professional, but carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in financial matters. The receptionist's eyes performed a quick but thorough assessment, taking in Naomi's appearance with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to categorize potential customers. The smile remained in place, but something subtle shifted in her demeanor. "Certainly," she said, though her enthusiasm seemed to have dimmed slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I was hoping someone might have a few minutes to discuss my needs," Naomi replied evenly. She had dealt with enough financial institutions to recognize the subtle signs of reluctance, but she pressed forward with the patient determination that had served her well throughout her career. The receptionist consulted her computer screen, her fingers clicking across the keyboard with deliberate slowness. "Well, Mr. Davidson, our senior loan officer is quite busy today. Perhaps I could schedule you for later in the week." Naomi glanced around the loan department, noting that several desks appeared to be unoccupied and that the general atmosphere suggested anything but overwhelming activity. "I see several officers who appear to be available," she said quietly. "I'd be happy to speak with anyone who has a few minutes." Before the receptionist could respond, a man in his 50s emerged from one of the glass-enclosed offices. Robert Davidson carried himself with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in banking, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit tailored to convey both authority and respectability. His corner office was visible through the glass walls, decorated with framed certificates, awards, and photographs of him shaking hands with local politicians and business leaders. Davidson approached the reception desk with the measured stride of someone making a deliberate assessment of the situation. His eyes found Naomi, performed their own quick evaluation, and she could see him drawing conclusions based on assumptions that had probably served him well in his particular social and professional circles. "Is there something I can help you with?" Davidson asked, his tone polite but carrying an undertone that suggested his time was valuable and probably better spent elsewhere. "I'm interested in discussing a business loan," Naomi replied, extending her hand in a gesture that was both professional and test of his willingness to treat her as an equal. Davidson shook her hand briefly, his grip firm but perfunctory. "I see. What type of business are you looking to finance?" "Commercial real estate acquisition," Naomi replied. "I'm looking at a portfolio of properties valued at approximately $12 million. The number hung in the air between them, significant enough to demand attention, but delivered in a way that suggested Naomi was accustomed to discussing such figures. Davidson's eyebrows rose slightly, though whether from surprise at the amount or skepticism about her ability to handle such a transaction was unclear. "That's quite an ambitious project," he said, his tone carrying a patronizing edge that made Naomi's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Do you have experience in commercial real estate?" "Extensive experience," Naomi replied, her voice remaining level despite the growing irritation she felt at his condescending tone. "I've completed 17 similar acquisitions over the past 15 years. Davidson nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he found her claims difficult to believe. "Well, why don't we step into my office, and you can tell me more about your background?" The way he said background carried implications that went far beyond her professional qualifications, and Naomi felt the familiar burn of anger that came with being underestimated based on her appearance rather than her achievements. But she had learned long ago that the most effective response to prejudice was competence demonstrated with unshakable calm. Davidson's office was a shrine to his 30-year career in banking, with diplomas from mediocre universities displayed prominently alongside photographs of him at various industry events and charity galas. The furniture was expensive but dated, chosen more for its ability to impress clients than for comfort or functionality. Behind his desk, a window offered a view of the city's financial district, a daily reminder of the world he aspired to join but had never quite reached. "Please, have a seat," Davidson said, gesturing to a leather chair positioned lower than his own desk chair, a subtle but deliberate psychological positioning that was designed to make visitors feel subordinate. Naomi settled into the chair with graceful composure, placing her briefcase on the floor beside her and folding her hands in her lap. She had sat in hundreds of similar offices over the years, and she knew exactly what game Davidson was playing. "Now then," Davidson began, leaning back in his chair with the air of someone granting an audience rather than serving a potential customer. "Tell me about this real estate portfolio you're interested in acquiring." Naomi pulled a folder from her briefcase and placed it on Davidson's desk. The documents inside represented months of research and due diligence, financial projections prepared by some of the most respected analysts in the industry, and property assessments that demonstrated both the viability of the investment and her thorough understanding of the market. "The portfolio consists of 4 commercial properties in the downtown core," she began, her voice carrying the crisp precision of someone who had made dozens of similar presentations. 3 office buildings and 1 mixed-use development. Current occupancy rates average 87%, with lease agreements that provide stable cash flow and significant appreciation potential. Davidson leafed through the documents with the kind of cursory attention that suggested he had already made up his mind about the outcome of their meeting. His eyes skimmed over financial projections that represented more wealth than most people would see in their lifetimes, past property assessments that demonstrated Naomi's deep understanding of commercial real estate values, and business plans that had been crafted with the kind of strategic thinking that had made her fortune. "These are very impressive documents," he said finally, though his tone suggested he found them anything but impressive. Very thorough. But I have to ask, what makes you think you're qualified to handle an investment of this magnitude? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Naomi felt something cold settle in her chest. She had been expecting this moment, had prepared for it, but the casual dismissal of her qualifications still stung. I've successfully completed 17 commercial real estate acquisitions totaling over $200 million in value, she replied evenly. My portfolio includes office buildings, retail centers, and mixed-use developments across 6 states. I think that qualifies as relevant experience. Davidson made a note on a pad of paper, though what he was writing was impossible to determine. And where did you get the capital for these previous investments? Family money? Inheritance? The implications of his questions were clear, and Naomi felt her patience beginning to fray. She had built her fortune through intelligence, hard work, and strategic thinking, not through inherited wealth or family connections, and Davidson's assumption that she couldn't possibly have earned her success independently was both insulting and revealing. I built my investment firm from the ground up, she said, her voice carrying a harder edge now. Starting with a $50,000 loan 15 years ago, I've created a portfolio worth over $300 million through careful analysis, strategic acquisitions, and disciplined risk management. Davidson leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. $300 million, that's quite a claim. I hope you won't be offended if I say that seems optimistic. Naomi reached into her briefcase again, this time producing a leather portfolio that contained statements from a dozen different financial institutions. Bank balances, investment accounts, real estate holdings, and business valuations painted a picture of wealth that few people could comprehend, let alone achieve. These are my current financial statements, she said, sliding the portfolio across the desk. Prepared by Henderson & Associates, one of the most respected accounting firms in the country. I think you'll find they support my claims. Davidson opened the portfolio, and his expression changed as he scanned the first page. The numbers were staggering, representing the kind of wealth that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. But instead of showing the respect such financial power typically commanded, his face hardened with something that looked almost like resentment. Well, he said finally, closing the portfolio without examining the other documents. If you have this kind of money, I'm not sure why you need a loan from us. It was a fair question, and one that Naomi had expected. Leverage, she replied simply. By financing 70% of the acquisition cost, I can maintain liquidity for other opportunities while still benefiting from the investment's appreciation. It's a standard practice in commercial real estate. Davidson nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he was looking for reasons to deny her request rather than ways to approve it. I see. And what would you offer as collateral for a loan of this size? Naomi gestured toward the portfolio. My existing real estate holdings have an appraised value of over $150 million. I'm prepared to offer a portion of those assets as collateral, along with personal guarantees and whatever additional documentation your underwriting department requires. For most loan officers, the conversation would have been over at this point. A client with hundreds of millions in assets seeking to borrow $8 million with substantial collateral was the kind of opportunity that banks competed for aggressively. But Davidson seemed to be searching for objections rather than solutions. Well, I have to say, this is all very ambitious, he said, emphasizing the word ambitious in a way that made it sound like a criticism rather than a compliment. But First National Bank has very strict lending standards. We're not in the business of taking risks on speculative investments. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. Speculative investments? These are established commercial properties with long-term lease agreements and solid cash flow. The risk profile is extremely conservative. Davidson waved a dismissive hand. That's your opinion. Our underwriting department might see things differently. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Davidson raising increasingly frivolous objections to what should have been a straightforward loan application. He questioned her business experience despite the documentation she had provided, suggested that the real estate market was too volatile for such a large investment despite the conservative nature of the properties she was targeting, and implied that perhaps she should consider a smaller, more manageable project to build her credibility with the bank. Finally, Naomi gathered her documents and stood up. "I think I've heard enough," she said, her voice carrying a dangerous quiet that Davidson was too self-absorbed to recognize as a warning. "I'm sorry we couldn't be more helpful," Davidson replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "Perhaps you might consider one of the community banks that specialize in smaller transactions." Naomi paused at the door of his office, her hand on the handle. "Mr. Davidson," she said without turning around, "you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Davidson chuckled dismissively. "I hardly think so. We get dozens of applications from people who think they're qualified for loans they clearly can't handle. It's nothing personal." "You're right," Naomi replied, finally turning to face him. "It's not personal. It's business. And you're about to learn the difference." She walked out of his office with measured steps, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that seemed almost musical. In the main lobby, she could feel the eyes of other customers and employees following her, some curious about what had transpired in Davidson's office, others making their own assumptions about why a black woman might be leaving the loan department empty-handed. But Naomi's mind was already racing ahead, calculating the moves she would need to make and the timeline she would need to follow. Davidson had no idea that he had just handed her the perfect motivation to accelerate an acquisition she had been planning for months. Her phone was in her hand before she reached the street, and she was dialing a familiar number as she walked toward her car. "Marcus," she said when her attorney answered, "it's Naomi. I need you to accelerate the First National acquisition. No, I don't want to wait for the quarterly results. I want to move now." Marcus Webb had been handling Naomi's legal affairs for 8 years, and his voice carried the kind of professional concern that came from experience with her more aggressive business strategies. "Naomi, what's changed? Last week you said you wanted to wait until their next earnings report to make your move." "Last week I hadn't been personally insulted by their senior loan officer," Naomi replied, sliding into her Mercedes and starting the engine. "How quickly can we structure a takeover bid?" "If we're talking about a hostile acquisition, we could have the paperwork ready in 72 hours, Marcus replied. "But Naomi, hostile takeovers are expensive and time-consuming. Are you sure you want to go that route?" Naomi considered the question as she pulled into traffic. A friendly acquisition would be easier, cheaper, and less disruptive to the bank's operations. But after what she had just experienced in Davidson's office, she found herself less concerned with efficiency than with making a point. "Make it friendly first," she decided. "Approach their board with a generous offer, but if they refuse, we go hostile. I want to own that bank, Marcus, and I want Robert Davidson to know exactly who his new boss is." 3 days later, Marcus Webb walked into the offices of Henderson, Carter & Associates, the law firm that represented First National Bank's board of directors. He carried with him a briefcase containing an acquisition proposal that would have made headlines in the financial press if anyone had known about it. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 40th floor of one of the city's most prestigious office towers, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the financial district below. Around the mahogany table sat 5 of the city's most prominent attorneys, men who had spent their careers facilitating the kind of high-stakes transactions that shaped entire industries. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, placing a bound document on the table in front of each attorney, "my client, Richardson Investment Group, would like to make an offer for the acquisition of First National Bank." The lead attorney, William Henderson, was a man in his 60s who had guided dozens of bank acquisitions over his career. He opened the document and began reading, his expression carefully neutral as he absorbed the details of the proposal. "This is substantial," he said finally, looking up from the papers. "Your client is offering $47 per share for a bank currently trading at $32 per share. That's a 47% premium." "My client believes First National is undervalued by the market," Marcus replied diplomatically. She sees significant potential for growth under new management. Henderson continued reading, his eyebrows rising as he reached the financial documentation that demonstrated Richardson Investment Group's ability to complete the transaction. Your client has the capital to complete this acquisition without financing? Correct, Marcus confirmed. This would be an all-cash transaction, closing within 60 days of board approval. The attorneys exchanged glances around the table. An all-cash offer at nearly 50% above market value was the kind of proposal that bank boards typically accepted enthusiastically. But Henderson seemed troubled by something in the documentation. "Mr. Webb," he said carefully, "could you tell us more about your client? Richardson Investment Group isn't a name we're familiar with in banking circles." Marcus had anticipated this question. "My client prefers to maintain a low profile, but I can tell you that she has 15 years of experience in financial services and has successfully completed 17 similar acquisitions. Her portfolio includes commercial real estate, financial services, and investment management companies across multiple states." "She?" Henderson asked, his tone carrying a note of surprise. "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "My client is Naomi Richardson, and she's one of the most successful acquisition specialists on the East Coast." The mention of Naomi's gender seemed to create a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, though the attorneys were too professional to let their reactions show obviously. Henderson made notes on his copy of the proposal, while the other lawyers whispered among themselves. "Well," Henderson said finally, "this is certainly an interesting proposal. We'll need to present it to the board and get back to you with their decision." "Of course," Marcus replied. "However, I should mention that this offer expires in 7 days. If the board isn't interested in a friendly acquisition, my client is prepared to make a public offer directly to shareholders." The threat of a hostile takeover hung in the air like a sword. Hostile acquisitions were expensive, disruptive, and often resulted in significant changes to bank management and operations. Most boards preferred to negotiate friendly deals that allowed them to maintain some control over the transition process. Henderson nodded slowly. "We understand. We'll convene an emergency board meeting and have an answer for you within 48 hours. 2 days later, Marcus received a phone call from Henderson that he had been expecting but hoping to avoid. "Mr. Webb," Henderson said, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering unpleasant news, "the board has decided to decline your client's offer." Marcus wasn't surprised, but he was curious about their reasoning. "May I ask why?" The offer was extremely generous. Henderson hesitated before responding. "The board feels that First National Bank has a long tradition of serving this community, and they're concerned about what changes might occur under new ownership. They believe the bank is better served by maintaining its current management structure." It was a polite way of saying that the board wasn't comfortable selling to someone they didn't know, someone who didn't fit their idea of what a bank owner should look like. Marcus had seen similar reactions before, though rarely with such generous offers on the table. "I understand," Marcus replied. "However, I should inform you that my client will be making a public tender offer for First National shares beginning Monday morning. The terms will be identical to what we offered the board, but the process will be significantly more disruptive." Henderson's sigh was audible over the phone. "We hoped it wouldn't come to that." "So did we," Marcus replied, "but your board has made their choice, and now my client will make hers." The following Monday morning, financial markets opened to the news that Richardson Investment Group was making an unsolicited tender offer for all outstanding shares of First National Bank at $47 per share. The offer sent the bank's stock price soaring and created a media frenzy as financial reporters scrambled to learn more about the mysterious investor who was attempting to acquire one of the city's oldest financial institutions. At First National Bank, the atmosphere was chaotic. Phone calls flooded in from shareholders wanting to know whether they should tender their shares, employees worried about their job security, and reporters seeking comments about the takeover attempt. In the middle of it all, Robert Davidson sat in his office watching his career implode in real time. Davidson had been following the news coverage obsessively, and he was beginning to piece together exactly who Naomi Richardson was and what her acquisition of the bank would mean for his future. Financial websites described her as a formidable acquisition specialist with a track record of dramatic operational improvements at the companies she purchased. One article mentioned her reputation for replacing management teams that had failed to meet her standards. His secretary knocked on his office door, interrupting his increasingly panicked research into his potential new owner. "Mr. Davidson," she said nervously, "there's a woman here to see you. She says she's from Richardson Investment Group." Davidson's blood ran cold. He had been dreading this moment, knowing that if Richardson's tender offer succeeded, he would eventually have to face the woman he had dismissed so casually just 2 weeks earlier. "Send her in," he said, though his voice barely carried across the room. Naomi Richardson entered his office with the same measured confidence she had displayed during their first meeting, but now she carried herself with the additional authority of someone who was about to become his employer. She wore a different suit this time, navy blue instead of charcoal, but the same expensive briefcase and the same unshakable composure. "Hello, Mr. Davidson," she said, settling into the same chair she had occupied 2 weeks earlier. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Davidson tried to summon the same dismissive attitude he had shown during their previous meeting, but the financial news playing on his computer screen made it impossible to pretend that he held any position of power in this conversation. "Ms. Richardson," he said weakly, "I understand you're attempting to acquire our bank." "Not attempting," Naomi corrected gently. "Succeeding. As of this morning, shareholders representing 42% of outstanding shares have already tendered their stock. We expect to have majority control by the end of the week." Davidson's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. "I see. And what does that mean for current management?" Naomi leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same careful attention he had failed to show her 2 weeks earlier. "That depends on several factors: competence, professionalism, and the ability to treat all customers with respect, regardless of their background." The implication was clear, and Davidson felt sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "About our previous meeting," he began, "I may have been hasty in my assessment of your loan application." "Hasty?" Naomi repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Is that what you call it when you dismiss a qualified borrower based on your preconceived notions about what successful people look like?" Davidson opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi held up a hand to stop him. "Let me tell you what's going to happen, Mr. Davidson. First, National Bank is going to become part of Richardson Financial Services, one of the most successful financial institutions on the East Coast. We're going to modernize your technology, expand your services, and dramatically improve your customer satisfaction ratings." She paused, letting the words sink in. "What we're not going to do is tolerate discrimination, prejudice, or the kind of casual dismissal of qualified customers that you demonstrated 2 weeks ago. Those days are over." Davidson tried one more time to salvage his position. "I understand your concerns, and I assure you that what happened was an isolated incident. I've been with this bank for 23 years, and my record speaks for itself." Naomi opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder that Davidson recognized with growing dread. It was the same loan application documentation she had brought to their original meeting, but it now bore additional notes and stamps from the bank's underwriting department. "Actually, your record does speak for itself," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "After our meeting, I had my legal team conduct a thorough review of your lending practices over the past 5 years. Would you like to know what they found?" Davidson remained silent, knowing that anything he said would only make his situation worse. "They found a pattern of loan denials that correlates remarkably strongly with the applicant's race and gender," Naomi continued. "Qualified minority borrowers were rejected at a rate nearly 3 times higher than equally qualified white applicants. Women seeking business loans faced similar discrimination." She pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a prestigious law firm. "This is a complaint that will be filed with federal banking regulators tomorrow morning. It details systematic discrimination in lending practices and recommends a full investigation of this institution's compliance with fair lending laws." Davidson's face went white. A federal investigation would destroy not just his career, but his reputation throughout the banking industry. However, Naomi continued, I'm prepared to hold off on filing this complaint if certain conditions are met. Davidson leaned forward desperately. What conditions? First, you will resign your position effective immediately. Second, you will cooperate fully with a comprehensive review of all loan applications you've handled over the past 5 years. Third, any borrowers who were improperly denied credit will be contacted and given the opportunity to reapply under fair and unbiased standards. Davidson stared at her in shock. You're asking me to destroy my own career? No, Naomi replied calmly. I'm giving you the opportunity to salvage what's left of it. If you resign quietly and cooperate with the review, I'll provide you with a neutral reference and a generous severance package. If you refuse, the discrimination complaint gets filed, and your career ends in scandal and federal investigation. The choice was no choice at all, and Davidson knew it. He had gambled with prejudice and lost everything. I'll need to discuss this with my attorney, he said weakly. Of course, Naomi replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. You have until 5 p.m. today to decide. After that, the complaint gets filed regardless of your cooperation. She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face him. Oh, and Mr. Davidson, that loan application I brought to you 2 weeks ago? It's been approved by our underwriting team. The irony is that if you had simply done your job professionally, you would have supervised one of the largest and most profitable loans in this bank's history. She left him sitting alone in his office, staring at the documents that would determine whether his career ended quietly or explosively. At 4:47 p.m., Davidson's resignation letter arrived in the executive suite. 6 months later, Richardson Financial Services completed its acquisition of First National Bank in what financial analysts called one of the most successful bank turnarounds in recent memory. Under Naomi Richardson's leadership, the institution modernized its operations, expanded its lending programs, and became a model for fair and inclusive banking practices. The loan that Davidson had rejected was eventually funded by Richardson Financial Services, enabling Naomi to complete her commercial real estate acquisition ahead of schedule and under budget. The properties she purchased became anchor investments in a portfolio that continued to generate exceptional returns for years to come. Davidson found new employment at a smaller regional bank, where his responsibilities were limited and his lending decisions subject to additional oversight. He never spoke publicly about his experience at First National, but colleagues noted that his approach to customer service had undergone a dramatic transformation. The office that had once been Davidson's was converted into a customer service center where loan applicants received respectful treatment regardless of their background or appearance. A small plaque near the entrance read, "Every customer deserves our best service every time." And sometimes, late at night when Naomi worked in her new corner office overlooking the city's financial district, she would look down at the banking floor where it all began and remember the lesson she had learned that day. That discrimination wasn't just morally wrong. It was also the worst possible business strategy. 2 years later, Richardson Financial Services was recognized by the Federal Reserve as a model institution for fair lending practices and community development. The bank's loan portfolio had expanded by 300% while maintaining the lowest default rates in the region. Naomi Richardson was featured on the cover of Banking Executive magazine as Transformer of the Year, with an article that detailed her systematic approach to eliminating bias from financial services while dramatically improving profitability. The article mentioned, almost as a footnote, that Richardson's acquisition of First National Bank had begun with a rejected loan application. But it didn't mention Robert Davidson by name. Naomi had moved beyond revenge to focus on building something better. At the annual Banking Industry Awards dinner, where Naomi received recognition for her contributions to fair lending practices, a young black entrepreneur approached her during the reception. "Ms. Richardson," the woman said nervously, "I just wanted to thank you. Your bank approved my business loan last month after 3 other institutions turned me down. I'm opening my restaurant next week." Naomi smiled, remembering her own journey from rejection to ownership. That's wonderful. And remember, never let anyone tell you that you don't belong somewhere. Sometimes the people who underestimate you end up working for you. As she watched the young entrepreneur walk away with renewed confidence, Naomi reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. A moment of discrimination had become a catalyst for systemic change, proving that sometimes the best response to prejudice isn't anger. It's excellence so undeniable that it transforms everything around it. The banking industry had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance, because you never know when that person might become your boss. This story reminds us that success is the best revenge, but using that success to create positive change is even better. Sometimes the person you dismiss today becomes the person who holds your future in their hands tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story of determination, justice, and the power of turning rejection into motivation, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because every day, people are proving that barriers exist only until someone has the courage and capability to tear them down.
If you liked the story and don't like it and subscribe and likely to comment, then your support a lot to me, and thank you. The Came Story, see you in new stories.